Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We are learning Mishna Nazir, new Masechta. We finished the Dharm yesterday, and today we'll be starting Maseches Nazir. So it's Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph, Chapter 1, Mishnah 1. Now, a Nazir is a person who accepts upon himself a vow of Nazirus. When a person basically declares, the most basic declaration of Nazirus is a person says, Hareini Nazir, I am hereby a Nazir. Being a Nazir means, as the Torah defines, that because of this accepting upon themselves this becoming a Nazir, this vow of Nazirus, they may not partake of any kind of grape products, they may not cut their hair, may not come into any kind of contact with a dead body. That's what's included in Nazirus. So the most basic declaration is, Hareini Nazir, I am hereby a Nazir. But now the Mishnah tells us, Kol kinui Nazirus k'Nazirus. All substitute words, a kinui, which we've had this before by Nadarim, a substitute word for Nazirus works just like a explicit declaration of Nazirus. There are certain words that are not the actual word of Nazir, but they are substitute words for Nazir. And therefore, the Mishnah says, all those substitute words of Nazirus are like a regular expression of Nazirus. Now, the next thing the Mishnah says is not actually an example of what was just said, because what was just said is a substitute word, which we'll see what that is. But the next thing the Mishnah says is, ha'omer ehei. A person declares and says, I will be, or I shall be. That's all he says. I shall be. What shall you be? So the case here is that a Nazir is passing by, and as a Nazir passes by, he says, ehei, I shall be. So clearly he's trying to say, I shall be like that Nazir. When he says that I raise a Nazir, this person now becomes a Nazir. Now that's not a substitute, because he didn't say anything about Nazirus. All he did was say something that through what he said, we understand he means Nazirus. So that's not really an example of a kinui, of a substitute word. It's an example of what we call a yad. A yad literally means a handle or a partial declaration. You make a partial declaration that we understand from that partial declaration that you mean what you mean. The same way a handle is how you move around a vessel, so too a yad in this context means that when you go ahead and you make a partial declaration of Nazirus, you say, I shall be, we know what you mean. In the case, we know what you mean because another is passing by. So it's not like you substituted anything. On the contrary, you didn't make a whole statement. But the point is that a partial declaration can work like a whole declaration in certain circumstances, and that is what now the Mishnah is reverting to. The Gemara actually says that the Mishnah is missing a few words. The Mishnah really should read all substitute words of Nazirus like Nazirus, and all handles and all partial declarations of Nazirus are Nazirus. It should say, Kol k'yun Nazirus k'Nazirus, v'chol yadais Nazirus k'Nazirus, which means all partial declarations of Nazirus are like an expression of Nazirus. And now, after that second statement, the Mishnah gives examples of yadas, of handles. Ha'imra hey, the person says, I shall be, and Nazir is passing by, I raise a Nazir. That person becomes a Nazir. Oy ehei naveh. Let's say again, the Nazir is passing by, and he says, I shall be Naveh, which means I shall be handsome. And what does he do? He doesn't just, here, the way they bring it down here is, he's not just passing by, he actually grasps onto the hair. Grasps onto the Nazir's head, and I'll say, I'll be handsome like this guy. But when a person grows longer hair, it's pretty clear from the Mishnah that makes him more pleasant looking, more handsome. The point is, afterwards, after you look really good, then you cut it off, because the Nazirus ends, you cut it all off. It's actually what you do is you destroy that beauty. But the point is that when he has his long hair, he is considered handsome. So he goes ahead, and in this case, he says, hey, Nazir. It's more than just the guy, hey, Nav, I'm sorry. It's more than just the Nazir passes by. He actually has to grab hold of the hair and say, I will be handsome. And he's holding on to the Nazir's hair. And therefore, we understand that he means to become a Nazir. This is the second example of the Mishnah of a yad, of a partial declaration that works like a full declaration. Now the Mishnah gives examples of kinuyim, of substitute words. A person says, instead of a person says, Hareini Nazir, instead of saying, I shall be a Nazir, I hereby am a Nazir, he says, Hareini Nazik. Or he says, Hareini Naziach. Or he says, Hareini Paziach. all these are actually words, as the Bartanura says, these are all words from a foreign language. It doesn't say which language, but it's some kind of a foreign language that when they talk about a Nazir, they call him a Nazik, or they call him a Naziach or a Paziach. So these are the substitute words. These aren't the actual words of Nazir, but rather they are substitute words. And when the person when he says these words, it's considered a declaration of Naziris. And as I bring down here on the bottom, it's not only, these words specifically. Any word they say here, the point here is about these words that are being said, they sound like Nazir, right? They sound like it. So therefore, he says, so they sound similar to Nazir because they originated from non-Jews who could not properly pronounce the original Hebrew. That's this case. Okay, although the Mishnah lists only these examples, Kinim in other languages are also effective, even if they do not sound like the words Nazir. So here, the examples the Mishnah gave were words that sound like Nazir. And as they bring down here from the Rambam's commentary, these were actually a corruption of the Hebrew words. These non-Jews couldn't say the word for whatever reason it was, and therefore they use these words. Okay, so these aren't the original words or substitute words, but they work. Now these words sound like Naziris, but they bring down here from Taisvis Yantiv, as I just read, that any word in another language that refers to a Nazir, even if it doesn't sound like the word Nazir, is going to work as a substitute also. Now, the Mishnah goes back now to another case, and this now is not necessarily, well, we'll see. Now the Mishnah says like this. A person says, Hareini Kazeh, I am hereby like this one. Like who one? Which one? Mm-hmm. The answer is the Nazir who's passing by. Mm-hmm. Nazir is passing by, and he says, Hareini Kazeh, I am hereby like this one. Okay, that is a declaration that he is saying, I want to be a Nazir. That acts as this would be a yad, a partial declaration that we understand what he's saying, and therefore it will work to make him a Nazir. Or he says, Hareini Misalsal, which means I hereby take upon myself to smooth down. Smooth down what? Well, in this case, you're grabbing the guy's hair, and you're saying, I take upon myself to smooth down, not his hair, my hair. And you understand, again, it's another way of saying that you want to be a Nazir. Hareini Mechalkel. He says, I take upon myself to grow my hair. Okay. I take upon myself to grow long locks of hair. Harei ze Nazir. This person now has made himself a Nazir. In the first case, we have a situation where when he says, Hareini Kazeh, that is a pretty clear, they bring down here, in the first case, his words clearly state that he accepts upon himself to be a Nazir like the person passing by. Okay? And they actually say here on the bottom that this is more than a yad. Not sure exactly why. It's more than a yad. It's considered an actual declaration. He didn't say the word Naziris, but, he says, I'm like this, and he's passing by. It's considered those words are fully understood, what those words themselves mean, and therefore they're considered a full declaration. In the last three cases, his vow to grow his hair makes clear his intention to be a Nazir who has been to cut his hair. Now, in all those cases, so let me read here from the bottom. These expressions are also not yados, because declarations are complete. When a person, however, the meaning of these terms is unclear. Sometimes they refer to hair, but in Hebrew they can also refer to other things that have nothing to do with hair. Thus, these vows are effective only if he grasps his hair during declaration, thereby indicating that he tends to grow his hair like a Nazir. So therefore, for instance, Hareini Mechalkel. If you heard that word Mechalkel, where do you know that word from? Mechalkel. What does it mean there? I'm going to grow my hair? With kindness? No, it means there, Mechalkel means to sustain. Right? So, the guy says, Hareini Mechalkel, I hear him take by myself Mechalkel. Mechalkel what? The answer is that in this case, he's got to be grasping the person's hair, and he grasps the person's hair. We know what he means. Now, in this context, Mechalkel means he's going to, they explained it here, Mechalkel means he's going to, again, grow, like sustain, right? It's going to grow. The word Mesalsal means to smooth. Smoothing what? So again, he grasps person's hair, then we understand, he means to say that he means to smooth, I'm going to smooth down my hair, like this person has smoothed down in hair, which means to say he's making himself into a Nazir. But they add over here the final expression where he says, which means I'm going to grow long locks, right? What does that mean? Locks as in Locks, right? And that means hair. That's what it means. Mm-hmm. And that the word para is a word that means hair. Okay, so it takes effect even if he's not holding the Nazir's hair. However, I believe though they don't say this expression. They don't say that down here, but I think he's got to be passing by. I think, not sure. He says, I take upon myself to grow long locks of hair. All right. So they say here, to grasp his hair, you don't have to, because para means hair. That's what it means. You don't need anything, you don't need to hold on to his hair to understand he means hair. The question I have is, do you need a Nazir at least passing by to understand that he's talking about growing long hair because of a Nazir, because of Naziris? If we know Nazir passing by and he says, I take upon myself to grow long locks. All right, so he said, I'm going to grow long hair. In the context of a Nazir? Maybe yeah, maybe not. Not sure. They don't mention that here. But over here, so again, one thing for sure, you do not have to be grasping onto his hair when you say this, but I'm not sure as to whether he at least has to be passing by. Now, the Mishnah concludes, Harei alai tziparim. What does the person say? I take upon myself the obligation to bring birds. Okay, birds for what? Well, the answer is the Nazir is passing by. And a Nazir has to bring bird karbanis if he becomes tamei. If a Nazir in the middle of his being, going through his period of Naziris, becomes tamei, and he has to basically start all over again, he also has to bring a set of karbanis, a set of sacrifices. And there are 2 birds that are part of those sacrifices. So the Nazir is passing by, and he says, I take upon myself birds. So and the Nazir is passing by. Is that a way of declaring that he wants to be a Nazir? So Remeir Oimer Nazir. Remeir says he becomes a Nazir because of the fact that, as we said, a Nazir has a situation where he has to bring birds, and the Nazir is passing by, and he's taking upon himself birds. We understand he means that he wants to be a Nazir. The Chachamim say, ain't a Nazir. He's not a Nazir. According to the sages, even though a Nazir is walking by, it is possible that he means to set upon himself to offer voluntary bird offerings, and not to become a Nazir. Since not every Nazir has to bring bird offerings. The point is that it's only a Nazir tamei that brings the bird offerings. So when the Nazir passes by, you say, I take upon myself birds. Is that a clear enough declaration that you want to connect it to the Nazir? Being that according to the Chachamim, it's not. Because according to the Chachamim, not every Nazir brings birds. There are voluntary bird offerings you can bring. And therefore, his declaration of, I take upon myself birds when another passes by, is not a clear enough declaration for Naziris, and therefore he does not become a Nazir. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
So,